In the last box plot that we looked at in Excel for the example 2.1, we saw that Excel automatically excluded a value, right? It didn't, in our box plot, it didn't extend all the way to the maximum value. So it said that that was an outlier. How do we determine them, right? And specifically, if we look at this example here on the screen, where are the outliers? Well, I'm just going to give you a moment to take a look at the box plot and say, well, those other ones are apparently outliers. How do we classify them? Just know when we use language of outliers, we're really meaning an extreme value. So something that is greatly different from most of the data. Okay, so there is a process that we use to identify outliers. Most of the time, I prefer to use the language of suspected outliers only because we have to use a mathematical process to rule them as suspected outliers, and then after that, then we can formally classify them as outliers. So for now, always use the language of suspected outliers without doing, if you are not doing formal mathematics. Here's the process. Don't include anything automatically, okay? And so what we're going to do instead is start with a visualization, box plot, histogram, blah, 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 something like that. Within that visualization, we're going to look at any values that appear to be extreme or just anything that is really different from most of the data. Okay, then we're going to use the 1.5 IQR rule to classify values. And the 1.5 IQR rule just really means anything that is more than 1.5 times the IQR from Q1 or Q3 is a suspected outlier. Okay, so again, we're kind of thinking if I'm were to capture this visually, okay, and let's say our box is here, okay, and this is Q1, right, and this is Q3, and let's say I compute it, and this red is the 1.5 times IQR. Anything that is outside of here, and similarly down here, this is 1.5 times IQR from Q1. So below Q1 and above Q3, anything that is kind of out here, and I'll highlight it in yellow, would be a suspected outlier. Okay, but even then, that's not saying that it is an outlier, just that it is a suspected outlier. And from here, then we just need to say, okay, well, is there anything that, or if it fits that definition of a suspected outlier, then does it fit the definition of an outlier, which means, or which is an individual falls outside of the overall pattern. Okay, if it does fit that, then we remove it. Okay, so that's why in this above pattern, okay, if we do the mathematical process and say, okay, this is Q1, or sorry, Q3 and Q1, I need to do a little approximation. So I'm going to say that this is about 10.5. Okay, and here I'm going to say that this is about 7. So that makes my IQR 3.5. Okay, and if I do 1.5 times the IQR, I get 5.25. 1.5 times IQR is equal to 5.25. Okay, so then what I'm going to do is say extend from Q3 5.5 in this, or 5.25 in this direction, so maybe that's right about here. So that would be this region, or this line. Okay, so this is Q3 plus 1.5 times IQR. And then I'm going to do the same thing from here. So this is 7. This goes down to about 2 and change. So this is Q1 minus 1.5 times IQR. Okay, so then anything that's outside of this range, this green box, I would classify as an outlier. Well, a suspected outlier rather. So that point, this point, and then these two, I would all identify as suspected outliers. Then I look at it and say, does it seem to be very different than the overall pattern? I mean, look at the gaps here. I would say, yeah, there's like, since I don't have like since I don't have dots or data points leading up to it, I would say, well, since there are gaps in the data, and these seem to be outside of those gaps, yeah, I'm going to say that these are outliers. If there were kind of data points leading up to it, I would probably say no, they are not outliers because there is at least some data that is not too, or that is showing that there's still a pattern there. Okay, but definitely these two at above 20, I would say those are outliers. Okay, so let's return to Excel and look at our example there. All right, and here is what I have so far in Excel. I just kind of continued the work that we left off with, and I found Q1 and Q3 just using percentile.inc and then 0.75 and for Q3 and 0.25 for Q1. And so then I computed the interquartile range, just taking the difference. And now I'm set to do 1.5 times the IQR. So to do that, I can tell Excel that I want to do an equation where I do 1.5, so equals 1.5 times the IQR, so that, okay, 8.55, and I actually have it set up so that I automatically computed, I just did cell referencing, so I did for the upper range, upper boundary, I would say it's Q3 plus 1.5 IQR, so 11.05 plus the 8.55. You can do this all manually too. Totally fine. And then the Q1 would extend all the way down to negative 3.2. Okay, so effectively I can go through my data and say, okay, are there any outliers? So I could order my data, look through it differently. Excel already identified that there does seem to be an extreme value that fits the definition of a suspected outlier, and it's right here. North Dakota, something's going on there, but that's an extreme value. Okay, so we said, okay, that's a suspected outlier, and as we look at the data, was there anything kind of close to it, or was it far out from from the other patterns? As I look through the data, the next highest value that I see is a 17, which happens to be kind of what the box plot put the maximum at. So Excel said it was an extreme value, the 20.2 that is, and I agree with that. So I would remove the 20.7 or 20.2 from my data set, and if I remove it, I literally just hit delete, then my box plot changes and I get what is called a modified box plot. Okay, so if you remove any outliers, you get from and then create a box plot with what remains. That's called a modified box plot. Okay, so big ideas to identify suspected outliers mathematically, we have to use this IQR rule and then identify those suspected outliers that are outside of that range, the 1.5 IQR on either side from Q1 or Q3, and then see if they visually are separated in some way from the overall pattern. If they are, toss them out and create a modified box plot.